thank you again. We have arrived at the final panel of the day, and I know that Jennifer just told you the official name of this panel, but I want to just, I want to highlight a couple of facts about each of these wonderful panelists that are here and going to spend the next hour talking about issues that I think are going to expand quite a bit beyond a narrow regulatory avenue. Because what you have here is an extremely diverse set of resumes and experiences. So immediately to my left is President Rumina Velshi, who is the President and CEO of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. That is the national regulator in Canada, equivalent to our U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But Rumina, in addition to having vast experience in the regulatory realm, also earlier in her career worked for OPG and worked with Ontario Hydro. So you have somebody who has a depth of, it is rooted in operational knowledge, and then went on to occupy such a prominent role on the Canadian regulatory landscape. To her left is Paul Kjellander, and Paul is listed, I think, as a former member of the Idaho Public Utilities Commission, but he also had an extensive career as a state legislator and very deeply involved in policy and natural resource dialogues in that capacity. He did go on to serve as a member and subsequently president of the Idaho Public Utilities Commission, but during that time was honored and elevated by his colleagues to serve as the president of NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, which is a very prominent body in state energy policy. And so, again, Paul brings those perspectives to this panel. To his left is Keith Kurber, who is presently a commissioner on the Regulatory Commission of Alaska. A bit new in the role, and Keith has acknowledged that to us, but also Keith retired from a long career, was a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army, and retired as a Special Forces Colonel from the Alaska Army National Guard, including multiple mobilizations during the global war on terror. And finally, at the end is Dr. Jennifer Uhle, who is currently Vice President of Technical and Regulatory Services at the Nuclear Energy Institute. But Dr. Uhle has an extensive background in nuclear regulation. She spent over 20 years at the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, occupying pivotal leadership roles both in nuclear safety research for the regulator and subsequently also nuclear reactor regulation, both the existing fleet, and was director of the Office of New Reactors. So I think what we have here is people with a long view and extensive reflection on energy policy, on nuclear policy, on the role that nuclear has occupied for humanity, to the benefit of humanity, the essential role that nuclear needs to play in clean energy transitions, and also the national security dimensions of those questions. So this panel, I think, is well positioned to share some reflections on what they've heard today, how they process that information in terms of this vast experience they have. So I'm going to start out maybe speaking to each of them and asking them to begin with kind of a broader reflection on the various topics we've heard today, but rooted in their experience over the course of their careers. So Rumina, you're seated to my left. I will start with you. Perhaps you could start by providing us with this perspective of the Canadian landscape, because again, you are working at the national level. So at a macro level, you have a national perspective, but you have extensive experience working with your peers around the world. So I might ask you also to kind of extend that out to a North American perspective and to a global perspective. You've worked hard towards greater alignment and integration both at the federal and provincial level within Canada. And that's hard work, but you also have challenged your peers globally to think more about harmonization. You have worked with the International Atomic Energy Agency and been a leader on initiatives there. You also, and I hope we will get to this, are a leader in the diversification of the nuclear workforce when it relates to the STEM fields for women and other underrepresented groups. So I'm going to hand it over to you just to share those reflections.
Okay, thanks very much, Christine, and truly an honor to be here at this Frontiers event. It's my third one, so Jennifer, who's not in the room, but I do want to thank her for making me a kind of a standard guest at these sessions. And so I'm going to touch on some of the things that have already been discussed on what's happening in the Canadian landscape, maybe complement what Ali said earlier on, and then pull some of the threads that have been discussed earlier today around alignment and collaboration. So as you heard earlier, in Canada there is growing momentum when it comes to new nuclear. Currently we have 19 nuclear reactors, all a domestic design, a can-do design, and it provides about 15% of the electricity in Canada. And the reactors are located in 2 of our provinces, but there is increased interest in many other parts of the country for nuclear as we look at maybe doubling or tripling our existing nuclear generation capacity. But some of the things that are unique about Canada, besides our technology, is that our existing fleet have, over the last few years, been going through a life extension program to extend their operating lives by about 30 years. And those projects, which are multi-billion, the one at the Bruce site, for instance, is $15 billion project. What's unique about these projects is, one, that those units, and the 3 that have come back online, have been on schedule, on budget, with impeccable safety performance. So highly successful. They have kept our supply chain active and robust, and they have really built the workforce, the project management skills, and the integration, the alignment, and collaboration within the nuclear sector for delivering on this project. So it has set the country up very well, both as far as delivering on the new nuclear, but also in building public confidence and trust in the ability to do so, and also have worked very closely with the regulator, and especially during the pandemic. And when it comes to advanced nuclear, until 6 months ago, all we talked about was SMRs. And in the last 6 months, as detailed work plans were being developed on how do we meet our 2050 targets or 2035 targets, became very evident that SMRs on their own would not be able to meet what's needed. And so large nuclear has got on the scene as well. So with SMRs, we have real projects happening. You heard about the Darlington 4 BWRX 300 units happening there. You heard about Chalk River at the lab, where they're going to have a demonstration plant of ultra-safe nuclear. At our Point Lepreau site, ARC, which is a molten salt reactor, there's an environmental assessment that has started for that. And for Westinghouse's Velshi microreactor, we're expecting an application for an environmental assessment to start for that in Saskatchewan fairly soon. Earlier today, all of you talked about the need for the policymakers, the regulators, the utilities, the indigenous groups, et cetera, all coming together. Well, that's exactly how our SMR development is happening in Canada. We got all the different players together at the table. There was a roadmap developed. The 3 kind of streams for SMRs, exactly as we talked about earlier today, for the grid. So these are the large, like 300 megawatts, 100 plus megawatt reactors. Off-grid for industrial applications, mining, for instance, or resource development of other kind. And then for our remote communities to help them get off diesel, very similar to what's been talked about in Alaska. So we have this roadmap that then got translated into an action plan, and now there's a leadership table with all these players that come together to make sure that we're working in a coordinated, integrated way to deliver on this. Because these need to be handled well, orchestrated well, making sure our resources are being well balanced and that we can actually deliver on these very successfully. And having that Indigenous voice at the table is critical. Canada is a signatory to the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, the rights of Indigenous people, and that means we need to seek free and prior informed consent before any of these projects can develop. So social license is very, very critical. And so what we're seeing with these new projects are partnerships, equity partnerships being developed with indigenous communities. So that's what's happening at the national level. On the regulatory side, when Christine was the chairman of the USNRC in 2019, Christine and I signed a memorandum of cooperation, August 2019. And this was a fundamental shift in how regulators work. We signed to collaborate, to share each other's reviews, to do joint reviews of designs. As I said, we were only familiar with the CANDO design. The USNRC had a lot more experience with the heavy water designs, with enriched fuel. We have a very performance-based regulatory framework that the USNRC was moving towards. So it was kind of a win-win approach. And so it was the regulators that started that collaboration, followed by the labs, followed by the utilities, et cetera. But the leadership really came from here. And so I want to commend you for that, because I know that was an extremely courageous thing for you to do. But that has set the tone in how we have gone forward with our deployment of, or planning for deployment of SMRs. You heard about OPG and TVA collaborating, but what's the fundamental principle behind that is the recognition that SMRs will be successful only if they are deployed as a standard global fleet. That means the design has to be standard. We need that cookie-cutter approach, none of those bespoke reactors where each one is a first of a kind. And in order to have that standard design, we need to have the regulators work together, we need to have the owners work together, we need the technology developer to make sure that the technology that they're developing is broad enough to meet the requirements of different countries. And so with the BWRX 300, that is what we're striving for, is a standard design to be deployed globally. So OPG and TVA have agreed to do so. We have now embraced Poland into that family because OSGE and the Polish regulator have agreed to work with us, and there are other countries wanting to do so. And so I've told you what's happening in Canada, what we're doing at the global level. I also happen to chair the Commission of Safety Standards of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So we're looking to make sure that the international standards are appropriate for SMR technology. And so with all this work happening, it's a pretty exciting time in a number of areas. One is the collaboration. One is the alignment. So we too have the province, your state level, and the federal folks to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts, that it's one project, one review kind of thing, and not each one going off on their own. We've got new provinces, new to nuclear, coming on board. So how do we make sure they build the appropriate infrastructure, that we reach out to the communities and let them know who the regulator is and how we manage things. So the OPG 4 units, the first unit is expected to go online in 2028, 2029, kind of the first grid scale SMR expected in the Western world. And things are coming along really well so far. I'll get to the other parts of your questions later on, but hopefully that's given you a sense of what's happening in Canada.
Thank you, Rumina. And as they say of the truly skillful, she makes it look easy. But I want to make one component of that. I think the setting the table where all the participants come together, my understanding is that was more than 2 years in the making. These national conversations that Rumina talks about in a casual breath or two are substantially difficult undertakings, but what I commend my Canadian colleagues, and it goes beyond the safety regulator, I think the NRK and Natural Resources Canada and other Canadian agencies were involved in this. And it's difficult to begin it, it's difficult to sustain it, and it's especially difficult to complete it successfully, all of which you discussed here today. So thank you for that. You've given us a lot to build upon. So Paul, let me turn to you. Rumina has laid out a lot of the components of collaboration and cooperation, and maybe something that would be useful at this time for the audience, and certainly for me, would be for you to talk about the capacity building efforts of the Idaho National Labs, the Frontiers Collaborative. We're focusing on first mover states. We've got announced projects. How would you give us kind of a report of what it looks like from where you sit, and is it bearing fruit? And, the efforts are about capacity building, but also sharing best practices, lessons learned. Are we building in the mechanisms to do that?
Sure. And before I jump into that, one thing I just wanted to share is one of the threads and takeaways that I'm going to have from this is what you just mentioned, and that is the relationship between Canada and the U.S. And I look at that, too, as something that we don't do enough of, especially when we have these shared transmission grids between Canada and the U.S. We do a lot of talk about resilience, reliability, and resource adequacy, but we don't have enough conversation about what those baseload dispatchable resources will look like in order to maintain reliability and resource adequacy. So as we look at some of these broader capacity building questions, I think that's another piece of the puzzle we need to look at. And it's a key piece, and I really applaud those efforts. We need to build on those and take that across other pieces of the puzzle. As I look at the capacity building now that I'm very fortunate to be able to do with the Idaho National Lab, and again, a lot of people have mentioned Steve Allmeyer, and I'll throw Steve under the bus again. It's his fault that I'm here. So anything that I say that makes any sense, it's because I've listened to Steve. For everything that I failed to say correctly, well, let's blame Steve anyway, because that's what we do. But as I look at that capacity building and where we're moving with state regulators, I really have to sit back and look at my own experience. As a utility regulator and the director of a state energy office for 20 plus years, in my backyard was the Idaho National Lab, the nation's premier nuclear lab. And as a utility regulator, none of the electric utilities that I regulated had nuclear in their portfolios, not one. And I sit back and thought, well, that's very ironic, But when I look nationally, and you do a little bit of level setting with that, only 28 states have electric nuclear reactors that provide electricity into the system. So it's a very limited number of state commissioners that have utilities they regulate that have nuclear in those fleets. And when you really look at that and take that the next step, until Vogel and the Georgia Commission, there has been no commission that has successfully in the U.S. deployed a new reactor. So when you really look at the need for capacity building, which was one of the other big takeaways from today, is that capacity building needs to happen now, not when the technology is ready for prime time. We've waited too long if we're not doing that capacity building now. So what we're seeing then is that with states, for the last 3 decades, everything that we focused on at the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC, we lovingly refer to it that way, because it certainly is a lot to spell out when you get there. It has all focused on nuclear waste. And only recently, DOE and Cheryl Moss Herman is here from DOE. Her and her colleagues recognized first that they needed to create a nuclear energy partnership to sort of help NARUC shift the dynamics of the dialogue and begin to explore what the advanced nuclear technology might mean, to at least start to get some baseline understanding. So then through our work with the Frontiers Collaboration at the Idaho National Lab, people before I came on board had been doing a lot of outreach specifically with Wyoming. And we heard earlier from Marcio Paz Barreto from the Wyoming Energy Authority. And they reached out to the Idaho National Lab, and I came on board later, but we started looking at what does that capacity building need to look like? And one of the things that the Energy Authority in Wyoming did immediately was to begin to create a Wyoming-specific advanced nuclear strategic framework. It wasn't a policy statement, but instead it was an opportunity to really take a deep dive into 3 pillars of the capacity building that needed to happen in that state if they were going to successfully move forward with the SMR project with TerraPower that had been announced in their state. And those 3 pillars were generation, supply chain, and value chain. And it was really all predicated and based on energy-driven economic development. And what does that mean in terms of that increased value to the state? And then what role can the state play in helping to facilitate that, that value-added piece of the puzzle? Where I came in from a state regulator's perspective is actually beginning to look more at the generation side. And what do regulators need to know? Because as we mentioned, very few states have any experience with new nuclear, but when you look at advanced nuclear, no state commissioner has any experience whatsoever, and are only now learning about the possibilities and the different opportunities that exist with nuclear battery configurations, with micro reactors, how those can connect into microgrids. It's easy for people to get their arms around SMRs, and I'm not saying that they're not important to look at. That's usually just the replacement for a coal-fired generator. So when we look at use cases there, that's pretty easy to wrap your head around if you're a utility. But when you start to look at the art of the possible as it relates to those microreactors and nuclear battery configurations, it's an opportunity now for utilities and regulators and state energy officials to start looking at this a little bit differently. What are those use cases for the technology that can solve real problems? Because at the end of the day, the only way we're going to get to that nth of a kind is if we can get the first of the kind on board. And so we need to start moving away from the concept of unit cost per kilowatt hour as we assess this as regulators, and maybe try to move away too from some of our traditional rate recovery methodologies and figure out a way to get to a whole system benefit approach so that we can start to see what the real value of this technology is as we look to solve real problems within the space that utility regulators face. So through the Frontiers collaboration, we were able then to work with NARUC and then another wonderful acronym, NASIO, the National Association of State Energy Officials. I used to be a member of that. Now NASIO is what we call it. It sounds like a good antibiotic would clear it up. But as we look at that, we realize that not everything is going to come through a regulated utility. Some of this is going to be coming through private industry. So they're probably not going to be knocking on state regulators' doors first with a certificate of public convenience filing or something that will show up in an integrated resource plan. It could very well be the Office of Energy or other policy advisors within a governor's office that get the first wind of all this. So we started talking to NARUC and NASIO and said, this capacity building needs to start happening now. What are the deliverables? What are the lessons learned from Vogtle? What are the lessons that we're learning from these frontier states that we can help other states as they move forward to not have to make the same mistakes or to be on a faster track to pull this together? Another thing to consider and keep in mind, the average tenure of a state commissioner is 3.5 years. 3.5 years. So what does that mean in terms of the turnover? You need to have a central repository where new commissioners can come in and immediately get up to speed as we start to look at this. Because again, the ultimate goal isn't to get everybody to yes, it's to make sure that the answer isn't no, because the real answer is I don't know. So in going to NARUC and NASIO and having those conversations, it led us to move forward again with DOE, in which they were very helpful to put some funding into creating the NARUC-NASIO Advanced Nuclear State Collaborative. That got kicked off in April, and it's on its way now. We've got a member of it right here. And when you look at the frontier states, every one of the frontier states that's represented in this Frontiers collaboration has somebody from their energy office and their Public Utilities Commission that is a member of that. And we are seeing more and more states become a part of it because as we start to see some of these barriers removed in legislation, we are starting to see regulators recognize and see for the first time in integrated resource plans that this technology is coming. So again, back to the main takeaway that I have from this is that the capacity building needs to happen now, but more importantly, we need to recognize that when we have these new technologies rolling forward, it doesn't mean we have to scrap everything we do from a regulatory perspective, but we have to recognize what our role is and then understand that there may be a need for us to massage the way that we look at these things in order to help move this forward, but it really has to be connected to that generation, supply chain, and value chain component. How does this translate back into energy-driven economic development? How does that make sense? And ultimately, we have to make sure that it's something we can justify in terms of rate recovery so that we have affordability as a piece of the puzzle as well.
Thank you for that, Paul. And it's useful to hear, kind of as we sat through the day, an important piece of connection you made or something that you would want to emphasize. I think for me, something that I was struck by today is deeper thinking is needed about the use cases and the uniqueness of the technology. If we simply take advanced nuclear or SMRs and push them through the mesh of what we've already done, I think there'll be enough flexibility and adaptability to make that work. But what are the opportunities we lose out on for communities and economic optimization and other things when we do that? So the uniqueness of Alaska and a lot of the use cases is something that I'll be thinking about as I travel home. And Keith, I noted that you were looking at Paul, nodding your head occasionally. A lot of what he's just said about his work at the state level in the regulatory space must have resonated with you, and I imagine bears some close relation to the kind of policy and regulatory and strategic conversations that are happening in Alaska as we arrive here in your beautiful state to have this event. What would you share with us on from that standpoint?
Well, thank you, Christine. Just making sure I'm okay. It's the microphone thing, right? So, hey, good afternoon, everybody. And one of the things that I'll start off by saying is, you know, when you're in an audience and one of the things you hear as like the fear or the concern is the regulatory process, right? I think that as a new regulator, I'm in my third year, I'm closing in on my third year anniversary. The thing that I think helps you through that process as that new regulator is understanding something that Paul just said, and that is that we don't necessarily have to recreate the wheel just because it's a new form of generation. Let me give you an example. He's already pointed out Cheryl Herman in the crowd. Cheryl and Audrey in the back, who's actually one of the key leaders at the Alaska Energy Authority, which would be our state energy office. I was with them in April at the Pacific Northwest Lab PNNL visit that was put together by this, NARIC-NASIO consortium to get us together, mainly from these frontier states, although there was Michigan commissioners there was people from New Mexico and Arizona and other states. And I think that when you're given a task or presented with the potential of receiving a new form of generation, if the hair doesn't go back up on the back of your neck, you don't have a pulse. Because you realize, especially given some of the conversations that are currently being had around what I call fuel sources, right? Like this fuel source is a good fuel source. Water and hydro, the sun and solar, wind, and then other sources not to be mentioned, perhaps of a fossil nature, not just oil or natural gas, but coal, right, are considered bad fuel sources. And I would just go to, because you sort of opened the door for me in this, I spent a significant amount of time taking notes because I'm going to go back to my commission and give them some feedback on how these meetings went. And so I'm going to go back to that P&L visit and just say this. That was my first ever out-of-state trip as a commissioner other than to go to the NARIC-sponsored rate school in the fall of 2021. And what's so interesting is that having gone to that class, the benefit, or the training rather, at PNNL was, the classes were good. The round robins to the various stations were really good. But where the money was made was, I can remember one night we got back from a trip, and I'm just sort of trundling across the particular hotel we had like, you'd go through the entryway, and then you'd come into a big open area, and you'd go to the building that was yours. And Cheryl and I were kind of put in the same building, and we got to chatting about a particular issue. And once you know, one of the first people I see come up to me was Cheryl, and I got to get up off my chair and say hi and all that. But then looking back just a moment ago and seeing Audrey in the back, it makes you know that you have friends in the regulatory space that you can rely on, that you can go to, that you can ask questions of, so that you can get the information you need to potentially, essentially black start a nuclear-capable staff section at your agency. The first thing that I thought of when I realized, oh my gosh, we potentially are going to be regulating advanced nuclear, which my colleague Paul took some of the pressure off saying, hey Keith, most of the states nobody's done advanced nuclear yet. But here's an example that happened right at that visit that I think highlights, for Paul, I hope, the success of what he's doing right now or is attempting to do through his INL connections to get us connected to the people who have knowledge. So surprisingly, the group was, I think there might have been 100 people at this thing. So you can read the names on the list of who's there, but the chances of you sitting next to somebody that you might really have some value from isn't necessarily high. So we got to this one facility, which was actually one of the key manufacturing facilities for nuclear fuel, which is kind of PNNL's remit, the whole supply chain for the nuclear space, as well as we heard from INL people today, and their mission is to provide nuclear reactor expertise, right? So I'd been to INL. Paul set up a visit outside of the normal visits because I told him, hey, we got a family reunion in Idaho. We could fly into Idaho Falls any chance. He goes, give me a couple days. And sure as shoot, he came up with a trip so that my wife and I could get sort of like, we were on the main campus, we didn't get to the desert site, but it was very humbling to be given that kind of treatment. And my wife's an educator, and of course we hear a lot about trying to increase STEM development of people who are interested in STEM fields. And boy, she left there bubbling with ideas of how they can get that going at where she's a contact teacher at. But so we're sitting outside the buses, and I looked over at the gentleman next to me, and I saw on his name tag, Wyoming PSC, and I'm like, whoa. And his name is Chris Petrie, and Chris is the deputy commissioner at the Wyoming Commission. And I said to him, man, I am so glad to meet you, because there's so much in common, I think, from a cultural perspective between the frontier states. You know, we may be geographically separated, Christine, and we may be more into the dog mushing than in the horseback riding, although there's a significant, for everybody's knowledge, there's a significant equestrian groups in Alaska, right? There are hunting guides that take people back on horses. So we may be in the far north, but we still understand our four-legged friends. And I said to him, you know, Chris, I was thinking, you guys appear to be a little ahead of us in this process. That was only amplified by this Frontiers Charter meeting when we heard from Marcio from Wyoming, and also from Mr. Wandler and Joe Miller, who are basically working in that particular state's nuclear ecosphere. And so I said to Chris, as we were getting ready to get on the bus, do you think it might be possible for me to just come down and like telework from your place for a week and just see what you're doing? Do you know what the guy did? I mean, he looks at me and goes, are you kidding me? No way, I don't like guys from Alaska. No, of course he didn't say that. He said, I think that would be awesome, Keith. He said, in fact, here's the deal. You can't fly into Cheyenne. I mean, he started getting super granular on how I could make this transportation thing happen. Well, so seeing Marcio, and Mr. Wandler, they're both sporting the same colors. They got the cowboy on horseback with the U.S. sort of flag logo emblazoned in it. They're wearing the colors of their state because they care about their state, right? And so that's, to me, for Paul's feedback, but also for hopefully the people who are here, I'm not going to be able to shake everybody's hand in this crowd. I mean, I thought that the gentleman, I was wondering, who's the lieutenant general here? And I was watching this one person carry and said, because I was retired as a colonel, I'm like, yeah, that guy could be the general, right? And sure as shoot, he was. And I wonder if he was the lieutenant general or the DCG for Futures Command when a guy named John Murray was there, who was a colonel in Iraq when I was there in 2007. That's how small the world is, right? We may have had a common contact with another human being. And in this case, like the worst time in a wartime situation. But I think to a certain extent, not to be hyperbolic or dramatic, but the people here, people like Dr. Waxman, who's kind of doing this like Manhattan Project to get advanced nuclear going at INL. I just met him yesterday. I got to hear him again today. I'm like, that's a guy I want to be keeping in my thoughts and prayers because he's carrying a load. People like Joe Miller, Mr. Wandler, they're carrying a load. Other entrepreneurs, the people from, I'm just going to say, the SpaceX buddies, the venture capital guy and the other guy with radiant energy, I think. There's some interesting takeaways from these people, which gives me great hope that even though we've never done it before at the state of Alaska level, other people have. And that, to me, is the victory of the Frontiers Collaboration Initiative. I hope that answered your question, Christine.
Thank you so much for that, and I think the Frontiers Project could be rightly proud that in a compressed period, you know, you found that much value in this preliminary engagement that you've had here. And I think Jeff Waxman talked about it earlier today. It is sometimes knowing that person to call, or that person you sit next to on a tour, and you make that connection, because you can feel very much alone in this work without the right network of folks to reach out to. And I know you were also, both of you were talking about NEI, and we're gonna turn to Jennifer on the end of the panel, because NEI, I think, has identified the need to help make connections and to provide support, because again, with the pervasive presence in the U.S. nuclear industry that NEI has, and working as a kind of central organizing function for a lot of the different components of the U.S. nuclear industry. Jennifer, that work now puts you in direct contact and provides you a persistent vantage point over how this new nuclear push, or advanced nuclear, is moving along. So as you look across all of the different sectors that NEI touches and tries to bring cohesion to this effort, what did you take from this afternoon, and what might you share as part of this panel?
Well, thank you for inviting me to participate in this session here today. Really want to say thank you to the other Jennifer. Great job in getting Christine Svinnicky to moderate this panel. I was fortunate enough to work with Christine when she was a commissioner at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. One of the most insightful, strong technical and policy leaders that this nation really has ever had in the area of nuclear energy. So on behalf of the industry, great job. If you ever are interested in taking on another role related to regulation, please talk to the administrations.
Oh, well, you know full well that I'm really engaged in the work I do now. But thank you for that. That's very kind. But you're out there toiling in the vineyard, trying to kind of bring the pieces together to make this happen. So you know, there are a lot of coordinating bodies that NEI sets up, and then they get populated with folks from the industry who come forward.
Absolutely.
I think that's the most constructive way, is to have the actual you know, people who occupy those roles come together and make it happen, much like Keith was talking about, maybe more intentionally than accidentally. So talk a little bit about that.
So the Nuclear Energy Institute, we are the trade organization for the nuclear industry. We have over 340 members, 13 different countries are represented, and Canada included, where the utilities, some of the Canadian utilities are NEI members. Really, we have a technical and regulatory group. That is my group. We also have policy, communications, legal, obviously, and government affairs. And we are every one of us, doing what we can. One, to keep the currently operating fleet performing strong and getting the policy support that it needs to really provide almost 20% of the carbon-free electricity in the United States on the grid out to, say, the 2050 time period. We're also paving the way for new and advanced reactors to be brought to the market and built. So in that, there are, when we look to the future, one, we need to recognize the support that the Hill has provided over the last few years. One of maybe the only couple of different areas where there is bipartisan support is nuclear. Billions of dollars have been invested into nuclear energy. Again, the operating fleet with production tax credits for the carbon-free attribute. Also looking at trying to provide investment tax credits for the future fleet, and paving the way for perhaps even more export overseas so we can compete with other countries such as China and Russia because of the 100-year relationship that nuclear provides a country when you export to a partner country. So great support. Democrats like nuclear because of the carbon-free attribute and the geopolitical influence. Republicans primarily for energy resilience and energy security, as well as the geopolitical influence. And we've taken a look at what restrictions there are in place for future deployment. We want to see nuclear play a key role in the energy policy of the future. It's the right thing to do. Now, I'm a nuclear engineer and I am biased, but others have taken a look at nuclear and recognize with our resiliency attributes, we operate 24/7, 365, very resilient to bad weather. We also have about 18 to 2 years of fuel on site. So we operate for a large time periods before we need refueling. There are great attributes that I think pretty much anybody you talk to in the public are recognizing the concept of nuclear needing to play a very strong role in the future. And to that end, if we look at the constraints that we have, obviously we've talked about them. We've talked about the regulatory process needing to be more efficient. We've talked about supply chain. Yes, we're working on both of those to ensure that we can realize this future. We also have siting issues, and though that is not just federal, but also state. But we also have social license issues that we need to make sure that people understand what nuclear power is and its beneficial attributes, and that people aren't making decisions based on lack of information. But it's hard when you're representing an industry to really get the points across to the general public. So we need ambassadors. We need all of you who do see the benefits that nuclear energy provides to go out and to talk about why nuclear power is one of the workhorses of the grid and is needed for a very resilient grid and a carbon-free and an energy independent grid. So social license, we all can play a role. We also need workforce. If we are going to deploy more nuclear, we need more people going into nuclear energy at the not only university level, but the trade school level as well. We have programs in place along with the Department of Energy to get curriculum developed in these different educational institutions. And right now we employ directly about 100,000 people, very strong, well-paying jobs, but we are going to need obviously a lot more. And so I look to all of you. For those of you who are playing a role in education, then please think of nuclear. Think about how much of an economic incentive it can prove to be for a local community, not only the tax base, but the great paying jobs. We're now seeing states that don't have nuclear power coming to the nuclear industry saying, we want nuclear. And they don't want just the nuclear power plant to provide that stable electricity, but also the supporting industries as well. So I think that the social license is something we can all work on, and also the need for the educational outreach so that we can have the workforce that we need for the future. And I do realize that Rumina and Keith spoke about the STEM area and efforts underway, but again, something that everybody in this room can participate in.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I was going to turn to kind of social license and diversification in STEM. I think those two are connected. I was going to explain that. But before I do that, I wanted to pause because I think we've heard some questions from the audience that touched on perspectives on regulation. I was going to pause here to see if there were any questions. I can continue this dialogue, and I will. Yes, please. We've got an individual seeking a microphone here in the middle section. I can, and
Thanks. Hi, Diane Hirschberg, Institute of Social and Economic Research at UAA. So as Jennifer was speaking, I was thinking about, we're having a lot of conversations about the new technology and that it is much safer than the old technologies, but no technology is completely safe. And we also understand that there's a lot of lingering concern, both because of past problems and also because we don't necessarily understand fully the new technologies. I'm one of those who's, I'm a social scientist. I'm also somebody who lived in California and recognized that conventional energy has also caused a whole lot of problems, and including the way that we have run our wires and had fires from those. So how do we have an honest and non-triggering conversation about the genuine risks to the technology, along with talking about how it is, as a new technology, likely much safer than the legacy nuclear? But how do we really have the honest conversation so people feel like, yeah, there is a risk, and we do need to understand that as we are making these decisions?
Rumina, is there anything you would share about how those conversations have occurred in Canada as part of the national dialogue and the development of the roadmap?
Certainly. And let me start off by saying, yes, the new technologies are safer. The existing technologies are extremely safe. So I wouldn't want anyone to leave this room thinking that, the newer, better, safer, the existing technologies are extremely safe. Mm-hmm. And so our debate is very much on how safe is safe enough. And so we make our decisions that are very risk-informed. And, so we've got our safety objectives. I'll tell you, in Canada, the issue has never been around the safety of our nuclear facilities. They have, as I said, an excellent track record. And so our debate is rarely around safety. It would be around for the new technologies, especially the more exotic, esoteric ones. Have they proven themselves? That's why we're very grateful as the regulator that the first SMR technology is light water technology, the BWR. X being it's the 10th evolution of it, a proven technology. Again, to build public confidence. But even with the advanced technologies, there are demonstration plans where people can go and kick the tires and make sure they're working well. And we would never regulate something unless we are totally confident that it'll be safe to operate. So for us, the debate has rarely been on the safe side, and frankly, for us as the regulator is also to make sure that we have the debate more on how safe is safe enough as opposed to can we make it safer?
It's interesting because the question originated from an attendee here in the room. For the folks who are viewing this over the internet, you can't really see any of the audience participants. But she raised this morning a question about coming into communities and issues of trust and historic injustices. And I reflected on that as she was raising it, as she received a response, and also throughout the day today. I leave here with a renewed humility about entering any conversation where I assume I know the needs of the other side, the concerns of the other side. And I think this was raised in terms of, it's not automatically that I need you to come into my community and tell me how radioactive the banana is that's sitting on the table. I mean, it's very presumptive. The first thing to do is to honor the space and say, I arrive at this conversation with a knowledge of this technology. You don't have that knowledge, but I have very little knowledge of how you arrive at this conversation. It is for you to help me to understand that. So I think that we need to engage very authentically. That's what I hear you saying, Rumina. I mean, concerns took a different form in your dialogue, and it could be about anything. I was listening to a financial analyst from a very large Wall Street firm, and he monitors the development of technology. He gave a presentation generally to say, we're this many years into the U.S. clean energy transition, what are we seeing and what is our perspective on things. And he made a comment that I had not, in all my time thinking about these topics in great depth, I hadn't reflected on the fact that for economy-wide transitions of this scale, when they have occurred in societies, almost, to an example, humanity received some better version of the next thing. Okay, the car was better than the horse, and the airplane was better than the car for certain types of travel. But the communities and the ratepayers and the people, we can talk about government support, we can talk about tax credits and things, but communities and societies are the ones paying for this transition. And to them, for end use, except for, I heard today that heat is more valuable in some places than electricity, that it will be a question of many people will feel like they're not getting a more elegant or capable or functional kilowatt hour than the kilowatt hour they got from a fossil heavy generation. So I think as a regulator, the important thing I internalized from that is the necessity of regulatory systems being efficient is not for industry players. It is for the ultimate consumer of electricity. If the regulatory system is inefficient, to me, that is an injustice against the public we serve. It is not, this very facile comparison to, well, you're just doing it to do a favor for some applicant or utility. Regulatory burden is ultimately paid by consumers and inefficiencies in the system. That being said, a thorough regulatory system, I think, can help with social license. We are representatives as regulators of the population and the general well-being and welfare. So I know that there is a lot of skepticism of authorities, of government agencies and government figures, but ultimately I think our ambition is to fortify the building of social license and confidence in the safety of the technology. And I'm getting a high sign about wrapping up the panel. I'm going to, in our conversations with each other off the stage, we talked a little bit about collaboration, and that was a theme that was woven throughout the panels today. So in certain African wisdom traditions, there is a saying or a principle that is, if you wish to go fast, go alone. If you wish to go far, go together. And I think that this is true in a very practical way in many parts of people's lives. But we can focus on the faster part, and there are parts of this system that arguably, are not moving at the pace that they need to support the clean energy transition. But there are also, what I take away is a general call that maybe the collaboration can be a force multiplier, can be a way that we don't each need to have the same positive or negative experiences, but we just can continue to build. I don't know if any of the panelists would like to build on that. Keith?
Well, Rumina, she
No,
raised her
you go
hand
ahead
first.
and I'll go
Yeah,
after
sorry.
you.
Okay, so I just, thinking back to the question that was just asked here is, especially in various places, how do you start that conversation? And it's already been mentioned before that there's, right now we're living through a time when there's a bit of mistrust of government, maybe writ large, but state government maybe not as much, but still government is government. There's been the comments about the different groups of people like the entrepreneurs, the regulators, the academics, the research people. And one of the things that I heard today that I was really struck by was from Marcio from Wyoming. And he made this comment, he actually quoted it. I'm working hard to talk slow because it's not my normal thing, because once you've been to war, you can kind of pick up your pace a little bit because things got to get done now, But at the same time, he quoted from General Stanley McChrystal's book called Team of Teams, right? And he had several leadership roles during the Global War on Terror. And one of them was commander of an organization called JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command. And so he made that into a team that was a high-functioning team. And the quote from Marcio was speaking to the issue of, we want to collaborate, we want to be creating a team of teams. And that team of teams, to go back to the question of how do we get the social license, is we're honest if we have situations that, historically go into the past. Like in Alaska, there's a few things, like there's a book written about potential use of a nuclear bomb to excavate a port or something. I want to say Firecracker Boys or something. I don't know. Yeah, people are nodding their head in the vertical direction. I haven't read it, but I've seen it on book stands. So if you acknowledge that there was things like that happened, you can say, well, I can't fix the past, but I'm going to work on trying to fix the present. And then I like what Marcio said when he says, we want to become a team of teams while ensuring we don't get drunk on our success and get our leader fired. So.
Anyone else?
I think the key is to be an honest broker in the course of all of the work that you're trying to do in that space. So you're always going to have those nattering nabobs of negativity. They're always going to exist. But the only way to really be upfront and forward with it, and the lab takes this approach, is to be an honest broker. And so as we start to look at some of the capacity building, for example, when we start to look at use cases that we hope will solve real problems for either utilities or industrial customers, as we start to delve into that deeper and find that there are some barriers we just can't get around, well, then it's time to recognize that, passion without pragmatism presents problems. Let's set that one aside and look at some of the other things that we can move forward on. And I think we have to be honest in those assessments, even as we start to take those next paths towards capacity building. But the key is to, and I think we've seen it in Wyoming as well, start to develop those fact sheets that can help legislators, the general public, and others to address some of those questions head on. Because if you can get that stuff together and if you can make it available, the one thing that you might be able to avoid are legislators who want to pretend they actually know an answer to a question during a hearing, and instead give them an avenue to say, hey, check out this fact sheet, here's the information, so that you don't have disinformation to begin with from people who are supposed to be the policy setters.
And what's the website, Jennifer?
www.nei.org. And we have fact sheets on just about any topic that is relevant to nuclear energy. So please, if you don't find something, then please email me or give me a call. I hope that you have my contact information. But when we look at social license and workforce and these potential other constraints, we are, as a community, coming together and taking on these issues one at a time so that we can pave the way for nuclear deployment here in Alaska and in other states and other countries.
And Rumina, I watch very rudely, you heard that ping, but I want to give you the last word to share something on this.
Thank you, and I love to have the last word, so thank you for that. But it's just something that was touched on briefly today, but what our ultimate goal is net zero. And we can do wonderful stuff in the United States and in Canada. It's not going to make that much of a difference. So the collaboration really has to be international collaboration and is to really help the other countries get to net zero. And so we can set the way and make sure that we're helping others come along too.
And on the way, help them get to net zero without remaining in energy poverty.
That is correct.
So thank you for that. We are at our time. Please join me in welcoming thanking this amazing panel.